You love her voice, you love her looks, but Melissa loves comic books. So hi, let's talk about, holy cow, what is that? Darkness outside that window? I know that I planned on doing this earlier today again, but here it is, the middle of the night, and I'm still recording again. So let's just deal with this. What was I going to talk about? Well, I have already done an episode about David McKay's Ace Comics, post-Superman, and how unchanged it was. David McKay's oldest title, King Comics, was equally unchanged for the rest of 1938, and I'm not even going to talk about that comic book for the rest of 1938 because I don't have anything new to say about it. But feature book, now that is a different issue. Feature book is the big one. It's the one that includes all their biggest material. Dick Tracy, Little Orphan Annie, Popeye, and it's going to have 4 more issues after Superman comes out, and then it disappears for the rest of 1938. What happened? Well, we're going to try to figure that out a little bit later. As you may recall, feature book was the first exception to the anthology standard of all other comic books that they adhered to at this time. Every issue would feature just one comic strip. Uh, Early issues included a large proportion of Dick Tracy and Popeye, but also both Little Orphan Annie and Little Annie Rooney. And in each issue, you would have reprinted a complete storyline from that comic strip. The May 1938 issue was the comic book debut of Inspector Wade. Do not feel embarrassed if you do not recognize this character. The public domain superheroes website does not even have a picture for Inspector Wade on their site, saying they couldn't find one. Although, who is this on this cover then if they couldn't? So, who is Inspector Wade? Well, Inspector Wade of Scotland Yard was a character in one of the mystery novels of Edgar Wallace. Wallace didn't have a hugely successful recurring lead character to his mystery novels, though. In fact, many of them were just one-shot novels, each with their own never-returning main character. When King Features Syndicate approached Wallace's estate in 1935 about adapting his stories for comic strips, and they couldn't talk to Wallace himself because he had actually died in 1932, they naturally wanted a recurring hero for their strip. And they chose, for some reason, Inspector Wade, not even the lead, but a supporting character in the Scotland Yard book, one of Wallace's novels. Either Wade had made a really good impression on the editor at King's Features who read that book, or it was a calculated decision that Scotland Yard was underrepresented in comic strips at that time. The Inspector Wade comic strip was written by Sheldon Stark, and you might think that this would be a fan fiction mashup between Big Bang Theory and Iron Man, but you're wrong. Sheldon Stark was actually one of the editors on New Fun issues 1 and 2 back in 1935. You might remember me mentioning New Fun number 1 all the way back in episode 2. So Stark goes on to write for radio and television, including the Green Hornet, in both mediums. This issue contains 72 pages of collected Inspector Wade strips compiling 2 stories, The Swiss Head Waiter, a story from the Scotland Yard book, and then The Black, a different novel by Wallace where Inspector Wade substitutes for Detective Minter, who was the hero of the original novel. Wade makes no more appearances in comics for the rest of 1938. Then he comes back, minor spoiler here, the following year when David McKay produces his next anthology title, Magic Comics. Popeye is back in the following issue, and this follows up on Popeye's last feature book appearance that reprinted the A Sock for Susan storyline from the Thimble Theater comic strip. The next storyline in the strip was Wild Oats, about Popeye's father, Poopdeck Pappy. Again, I'm going to just summarize from the excellent write-ups that you can find yourself at the Popeye the Sailorpedia website. Although Popeye has given away the fortune that he was rewarded when he returned Susan home to charity, he has kept a sizable nest egg for himself, $10,000, in a wall safe. When that money goes missing, he naturally suspects the only person he ever confided in about this nest egg, and that was his own father. Popeye enlists the aid of the magical creature Eugene the Jeep to prove Pappy's innocence, but soon discovers that Pappy has been bribing Eugene with food to not reveal what Pappy is up to, which includes deliveries of jewelry to the house that he happens to share with Popeye. Popeye's concern soon switches. His concern soon switches. A lot of the same sounds there. From where Pappy got his money to what he's doing with it, as it's wooing a much younger woman, something that the more ethical Popeye had refused to do when Susan was into him. But as unethical as Popeye thinks that is, Pappy's behavior gets much worse. Realizing that he can get any women that he wants just by dangling expensive jewelry in front of them, Pappy then woos that girl's mother, then 6 more women in a row, staying out until dawn with them. When Popeye asks Olive Oil to talk to Pappy for him, Pappy gets a date out of Olive too. Now, Pappy turns out to have a cruel streak. He gets in a physical brawl with Olive over the ring he baited her into the date with, but Olive wins because she's really good at kicking. Then Popeye learns that earlier in the night, Pappy had pushed one of his dates into the river for eating onions. On assault charges, the police make multiple attempts to try and capture Pappy, but unlike Olive, Pappy is able to best each police officer. Pardon me, my dog won't stop scratching the floor. What is wrong with you? Come over here. All right. He's coming up on my lap. I guess we're doing this again tonight. He knows when I'm making videos now. Where was I? Oh, yes. Despite making multiple attempts to try and capture Pappy, but unlike Olive, Pappy is able to best each officer who comes for him. Finally, the police ask Popeye to bring his father in. Popeye does, but he also hires a lawyer first for Pappy. In court, Pappy alternates between flirting with the women on the jury and blurting out things that keep undermining his lawyer's case. Then things get even worse for Pappy when the prosecutor brings in a character witness, an old sailing mate of Pappy's called Bill Squid, who claims Pappy used to be a vicious pirate. Pappy's victim then changes her story and reveals that Pappy not only pushed her in the river, but deliberately tried to drown her. And further, Pappy confesses to his lawyer that he did steal the money from Popeye and planned to use that to pay him. The guilty verdict comes in without any deliberation. In the end, Pappy shows some regret for stealing from his son and returns what's left of the $10,000, which is less than $8. Feeling that this somehow cleared his conscience, Pappy goes to jail happily. It's a weird bookend to A Sock for Susan, which was all about Popeye's ethics and morality, and a real surprise to learn about when you grew up reading, or rather watching, the more sanitized Popeye cartoons on TV. The next issue star was created by Frank Miller. No, not that Frank Miller. This Frank Miller was born in 1898, started being a cartoonist in 1919, and through the 1920s and early 1930s worked locally in Colorado for the Denver Post and Rocky Mountain News. In 1935, he started his first successful strip, Barney Baxter in the Air, an aviator strip that was picked up by King Features by the end of 1936. Barney Baxter was one of those aviator strips that looked authentic because Miller himself was an aviator, though when World War II breaks out, interestingly, Miller joins the Coast Guard instead of the Army Air Forces. Barney Baxter started out as a young teen aviator, but was aged into his 20s when World War II started so that he could enlist. He still retained his boyish, freckled look in his 20s. The most unusual thing about the strip was that every character was drawn to look normal, except for his comic sidekick character, Gopher Gus, who is drawn in an exaggerated, cartoony way, like he belongs in maybe Stuffy Smith's world instead of this one. This trope may seem familiar to you by now. It may remind you of Slam Bradley and his cartoony sidekick Shorty, or the earlier precedent of Wash Tubbs adventuring with Captain Easy. Other than that, Barney would often go up against bad guys like air pirates and spies, standard aviator stuff, you know. I don't really know what the contents of this issue were. I do know that the contents were very recent. The earlier issues, Popeye and Inspector Wade, they had come from strips that ran in the newspapers in 1937, but this came from 1938 itself. It was reprinting strips that came out earlier that same year, something that was very rarely done in comic books. And that's it. Then the following month, something even more different happened. There was no comic strip reprint at all. This would be the one time a feature book featured original material, though its originator was no stranger to comic strips. George Jimmy Thompson was a famous Canadian cartoonist going back to 1925. In 1937, he immigrated to the U.S., possibly because there was more money in comic strips in the U.S. Soon he was given the art chores on new strips, War on Crime, and Roy Powers' Eagle Scout, and was assisting on the venerable strip Hair's Breadth Harry. But Thompson wanted to do something about Native Americans, people he had a special affinity for and a good deal of knowledge about. David McKay gave him all of issue 16 to tell the story of Red Eagle, a complete story that some might consider the earliest graphic novel written in comic book form. And then the month after that, no feature book. None for October, November, or December either. So what happened? Well, you know how I like to conjecture about these things, so let's try it out. Could it be that feature book was going to become a vehicle for more original material that just didn't materialize? Could that material have been more work from Thompson? Thompson goes on to appear in Magic Comics, which I mentioned earlier, debuts the following year in 1939, and he has a strip called Indian Lore at that time. Maybe that was going to be all of issue 17. Maybe the rest of Magic Comics was originally going to be issues of feature comics, and it fell through. And in 1939, when feature books comes back, then they decide to just go back to reprints and do the all this original material as a new book. I don't know, but it's always fun to speculate, isn't it? It will be April 1939 when this comes back, so it'll be a while until we talk about feature book again. In the meanwhile, we'll have more books to talk about in the coming episodes, and we're going to be getting back to Detective Comics and its sister titles. So I hope that you're looking forward to that as much as I am. And Jasper says bye. Say bye, Jasper. There you go. And I hope that you liked and subscribed. If you haven't already, maybe you could do it now. And I'll see you then. Bye-bye.